Now, we reported the big news on immigration at the top of this program, but there are plenty other important stories going on in America's capital. Here again is our chief Washington correspondent, Eric Ham.
Outside of the zero tolerance policy, there are a number of other issues that are impacting Washington right now. Just last night, the Senate gave a stunning rebuke to President Trump as they rejected his proposal for a clawback funding of $15 billion. Now, what that means is there was an additional $15 billion surplus that the government had, and the president's proposal called for taking that $15 billion and using it to pay down the national debt. And he got overwhelming support in the House of Representatives where they passed the proposal. But in the Senate, he ran into a roadblock, namely of Senator Richard Burr and Susan Collins, Republican senators, members of the president's own party, who stunningly rejected the proposal and sided with Democrats to actually not move this legislation. Now, this is the second time this week the president has gotten a rebuke from the Senate. Earlier this week, the Senate passed a defense appropriations bill that overruled the president that disallows Chinese telecom giant ZTE from doing business in the United States. And so we're seeing the president's party speak out more voicefully, more vocally, and reject many of this president's policies and proposals. There's also a continuing revolving door impacting the White House. We're now learning that Joe Hagan, who is the Deputy White House Chief of Staff for Operations, will be leaving his post and heading back to the private sector. Now, that name may not ring a bell because he's not a high-profile person, but he was instrumental in planning the Singapore summit and organizing the president's visit with Kim Jong-un in Singapore. In fact, on the way back from Singapore, the president made a rare trip to the staff cabin of Air Force One, where he led the staff in a standing ovation of Joe Hagan for his work on the summit. Now, with Hagan's departure, this brings the number to 60% of the president's senior staff that have left the White House since he was inaugurated more than a year and a half ago. And Hagan actually was considered to the #2 post of the CIA before he made his resignation public from the White House. Also, the president is actually looking at merging departments. He's looking at taking the Department of Education and the Department of Labor and joining the two together. However, in order for this to get done, he will need support and approval from Congress for this to happen. Now, we do not have an actual proposal, and the White House hasn't spoken out on their idea of merging the two departments, but this is something that the Trump White House is looking into doing. Now, we do know that the Department of Education is one of the smallest U.S. government agencies with only 3,900 employees, whereas the Department of Labor is an agency of more than 15,000. So we're still going to be, we still are watching to see what will happen, what will take place, and how this merger will impact the ability of both agencies to deliver on goods and services. Finally, the Supreme Court has ruled on a case that will allow internet companies to tax goods on services purchased online. Now, we already see large companies doing this. In fact, companies like Amazon and eBay already tax goods and services that are sold online. But what this ruling does is it allows smaller companies, and it paves the way for smaller companies to now tax goods that are sold via online services through their companies. And it's also important to note that there are only 4 Supreme Court session days left in this spring session, and we're eagerly awaiting the ruling from the Supreme Court on the president's controversial Muslim travel ban. Now, that was one of the final cases to be heard by the court this session, so it will probably be the last ruling we'll get from the court before they adjourn. Well, everyone is watching and waiting to see what the ruling in fact will be. I'm Eric Ham for Rise News, Washington.